I'm Dr. Kelly Brogan. You may know me as a New York Times bestselling author of a book with an exploding pill on the cover, renegade psychiatrist, pole dancer, or honorary member of the Disinformation Dozen. What can I say? I'm a born provocateur. I've spent most of my recent life exposing deceptions, connecting dots, and discovering the secret places my inner victim is still waiting to be liberated. And now I feel called to help you reclaim all of your parts, your health, your sexuality, your power, and your expression, so that you can finally truly own yourself. I want to ignite in you that inner knowing and the pulsing vitality that lives beneath your disempowerment, disconnection, and resentment, so that you can audaciously, courageously, and playfully alchemize your struggle into the specific pleasure of who you are. This is Reclamation Radio. Hi, and welcome back to Reclamation Radio. I am Dr. Kelly Brogan, and I am here today in conversation with Professor Sam Vaknin on the subject of narcissism. And his body of work, which has spanned over decades, in an effort to raise awareness around what has now become such a colloquial term that in social media and in the zeitgeist of relationship navigation, everyone seems to be able to diagnose the pathology of narcissism, have an opinion on it, feel victimized by it. And I want to offer, before we dive in, a bit of a caveat, because as I mentioned, before we started recording, I've spent the better part of the past 15 years challenging the concept of mental illness, psychiatric diagnoses through my published literature, through my clinical experience. And I do acknowledge that if psychiatry is good at something, and if psychiatrists are skilled in a particular way, it is around pattern recognition. And, so-called cluster B personality disorders are patterns and represent patterns, I think you would agree, that impact many of our lives and relationship experiences. So I would love to explore what you have divined, from your experience and your research. And I also want to frame that your perspective, from my best understanding of it, does align with my ethos on personal responsibility, because there is a very powerful field of victim consciousness around this concept of narcissism. All you have to do is speak to 10 women and you'll find 10 stories of their, experiences of narcissistic abuse. And I think that it's become a cover for a lot of victim stories, victim energy, and disempowerment. I would say especially for women. And a lot of what I've understood you have to share, I'd love to get into, is that this is a dance, a dance of two, matched individuals, often in relationship. And I want to talk about the role that you see, this mother projection. I would call it mother woundology. Because that's very much in line with a lot of what I've been exploring. So thank you for being here, Sam. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And let's just start with the basics, because there is such this, sort of socialized understanding of what narcissism is, and everybody has their own opinion. How would you define it? Like, what actually is this entity? And I know you would say probably it has many different shades and sort of fragments within it. How would you define what you believe and have studied narcissism to be?
I think we tend to confuse the clinical entity, pathological narcissism, with narcissism as an organizing principle of postmodern society and civilization, as an explanatory principle, not dissimilar to religion, whereby we make sense of our lives and we imbue our lives with meaning and direction and purpose using the percepts and tenets of narcissism. So narcissism serves to organize modern life. That includes politics, show business, intergender relationships. I mean, you name it. Narcissism simply explains it all. And it is distinct and should be distinct from the clinical entity. It is because we conflate and confuse the two that we have this pandemic. And the pandemic is not a pandemic of narcissism, but a pandemic of misattributing narcissism, mislabeling narcissism, misperceiving narcissism. And the tsunami of misinformation, disinformation, utter nonsense, and ridiculous tropes that afflict us because we conflate and confuse the two. So first of all, many people have what is known as narcissistic style. That's Len Sperry's phrase, not mine. It's someone who is an a-hole or a jerk. Many people have this, men and women. Women increasingly more so because women are becoming more and more masculine, stereotypically masculine. That has nothing to do with pathological narcissism, and definitely nothing to do with narcissistic personality disorder. The truth is that only a tiny percentage of the population suffer from narcissistic personality disorder, anywhere between 1 and 2% of the general population, 5 to 6% of the clinical population suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, we are using an outdated text which should have been trashed something like 3 decades ago, and that's a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. In its latest iteration, which is the text revision of the 5th edition, it's as trashy as before. Nothing has changed. The only thing was a wink at state-of-the-art knowledge by introducing what the DSM committee called the alternative models of personality disorders. So now we have two definitions of narcissism. One is the old, a copy-paste job, the 9 criteria in the DSM-4, which migrated mysteriously into the DSM-5 text revision 25 years later, or 30 years later, actually. And we have the alternative model of narcissistic personality disorder at the very end of the book, among the appendices, and it's a much better encapsulation of what narcissism is, because it's dimensional. Let me try to shed a different light on narcissism. If I were asked to define narcissism, I could choose the DSM-4 path and describe behaviors, most of them antisocial behaviors, one way or another, lack of empathy, exploitativeness, destructive envy, and so on and so forth, so negative affectivity and so on. So this is a descriptive way, a phenomenological way, which is very primitive, because these behaviors are common in many, many other mental illnesses, alleged mental disorders, and what have you, and this creates a phenomenon known as comorbidity. And another phenomenon, less known, which is known as polythetic problem. Never mind that. What it means simply is that when you stick to behaviors, when you make a list of behaviors and diagnose people because they are behaving in a certain way, you're bound to misdiagnose many people. And you're bound to slap multiple labels on the same person, which is bad practice. It's absolutely bad practice. So today, there's another text. It's the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11. It's published by the World Health Organization, but don't hold it against it. And it's actually an excellent text because it does reflect cutting-edge thinking about personality disorders. For example, in the ICD-11, there is no narcissistic personality disorder. Actually, there's no personality disorder of any kind. There's a single diagnosis of personality disorder with multiple facets, multiple manifestations and dimensions. So you are diagnosed with a personality disorder with a narcissistic overlay. You're more prone to be a narcissist than anything else, or with an antisocial outlay, with a borderline or emotionally dysregulated outlay. The thing is this: anyone who's ever worked with walking, talking human beings knows that people are sometimes narcissists, and then the week after they're borderlines, And then if they get really pissed off at you, they become psychopaths, and then etc. etc. These diagnoses are utterly artificial. People are not ponds, they are rivers. They flow. Everything is in flux. These are simply different facets or different shimmering facade that disguises a core problem. And the core problem is probably social, not clinical, not mental. An inability to function within society in ways which society deems acceptable, sublimated. So when you disobey the rules, when you hate authority, when you're contumacious, when you're defiant, when you're reckless, they call you a psychopath. When you think that you're better off or better than others, when you feel superior and haughty and you're entitled to exploit other people and so on and so forth, they call you a narcissist. But these have nothing to do with any mental reality. These are modes of functioning. These are personality styles. These are ways that we interact with fellow beings. So there's a serious philosophical problem here. Serious philosophical problem. With the exception of borderline personality disorder among cluster B, I would very much hesitate to consider psychopathy a mental illness or antisocial personality. And I think that narcissistic personality disorder is a post-traumatic condition. And I think that even borderline has a strong element of complex trauma, which expresses itself via emotional dysregulation and a host of other phenomena. We are lost. We are lost because we insist to pigeonhole people. And we insist on the pretension that psychology is a science. It's not. It's a pseudoscience. It's a form of literature. The greatest psychologists were probably Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, Musil. So, and Freud, who was a literary genius, much more than a rigorous scientist. So, I would define narcissism, coming back to circuitously coming back to your question, I would define narcissist as someone who is unable to perceive other people as external and separate. So what he does, this kind of person, I'm saying he, but it's a she, 50% of women. What a narcissist does, they convert other people, what is known as external objects. They convert other people into internal objects. They create avatars. They create representations of other people in their mind. I call this process snapshotting. Clinically, it's known as introjection. So they create representations of other people in their minds, and then they continue to interact with these representations. That's a major hallmark of narcissism. And the second major hallmark of narcissism, pathological narcissism is a disruption in the process of forming a functioning self. So ironically, narcissists are selfless. They don't have a self. They don't have what Freud used to call an ego. They're not egoists because they don't have an ego. Because they don't have a functional, constellated, integrated self, and because they don't have an ego, the ego is our way of interacting with reality. The ego is the mediator between us and reality. Because they don't have this, they have impaired reality testing. They misperceive reality. They live in fantasy. They use other people to regulate their internal landscape. So they use other people to regulate their sense of self-worth, for example. This is known as external regulation. It's also common in borderline. So these are the two core features. I don't think it's very important that they're exploitative. I don't even think it's very important that they lack empathy, honestly. That's not the core issue, really. The core issue is they cannot perceive you as separate and external, and so you have no rights. And you have no, they don't allow you to be independent or agentic or autonomous, and because you don't exist. Your independent existence threatens them. They feel threatened by you. And similarly, at the same time, they need you. in order to feel good, or even more so, in order to feel that they exist. That's it. That's narcissism, in effect.
I remember when I was on the floors in the hospital, we would be encouraged to deride, people who were diagnosed with cluster B personality disorders, and we would say, it's just another "fuck you, don't leave me" patient, right? Because of that energy you're describing that says it's like pushing and pulling. So you're depicting this sort of this pattern of defenses that develop from a traumatic, response, where individuals become like infrastructural support for the so-called narcissists' self-concept, right? So where do you think, what is like a typical pattern of childhood experiences, maybe particularly with the mother, that could give rise to this, if this is a socialized, um, experience for these individuals?
Narcissism is a very early reaction. Pathological narcissism is a very early reaction. And so, unfortunately, it's the mother, not the father. The father assumes a very important role in development much later in life, usually after age 3 years old. I mean, from age 3 onwards. And the father's role is limited generally to socialization. The father conveys, how he should behave, social scripts, skills. Skill acquisition is the father is helpful with this, and so on. So father is much more instrumental. Father is the equivalent of a teacher, actually. The mother is the one who shapes the internal world of the child. And contra to the self-help scam industry and its claims, this internal world is almost cast in stone. Once you have transitioned beyond a certain age, some things can never be changed.
Hmm.
They can never even be mitigated or ameliorated. It's done. That's it. That's who you are.
It's quite bleak.
It is,
Yeah.
but it happens to be factual. For example, attachment styles, which form very early on, according to Bowlby and others, and according to modern research, attachment styles are literally immutable. There are many claims online that attachment styles can change and so on. These are claims by self-enriching, self-interested, self-styled experts. But the truth is that the vast majority of attachment styles are lifelong. Similarly, disempathy, a lack of ability to experience emotional empathy, because everyone has empathy. Narcissists and psychopaths have empathy. They have a special kind of empathy, which I labeled cold empathy. It's a combination of cognitive and reflexive empathy. So they do have empathy. If if they were devoid of empathy, they wouldn't have been able to exploit and abuse people. To interact with people in any meaningful way, even negatively, you need to have empathy. So, but the inability to experience emotional empathy is lifelong, cast in stone, utterly unchangeable. Period. Anyone who claims otherwise is a con artist. So the damage, the damage inflicted by um, bad mothers, or what Andre Green calls dead mothers, metaphorically dead mothers, mothers who are emotionally absent, who are depressive, who are selfish and narcissistic, who are insecure, mothers who instrumentalize the child, mothers who parentify the child. These kind of mothers, the damage they inflict is regrettably a lifespan damage. It goes well into adulthood, and you cannot get rid of it. And so I think there are three developmental trajectories to narcissism. One is if you are ignored as a child, if you're ignored, abandoned, and rejected, frustrated on a regular basis. That's one trajectory. The other one, if on the very contrary, you're idolized, pedestalized, spoiled, pampered. In other words, if you're not allowed to separate from the parent and confront reality, if the parent isolates you and firewalls and keeps telling you that you can do no wrong and you're perfect and you're godlike and so on, that's another trajectory. because it denies the child the ability to grow up and to separate from the parent. We grow up only via losses and failures. These are the sole engines of growth. We learn nothing from success. We learn a lot from loss and failure. And when the child is smothered and pampered and spoiled, the parent does not allow the child to experience loss and failure. So that's a form of abuse. So that's a second trajectory. And the third trajectory is known as, in behaviorism, as intermittent reinforcement. It's when the mother is sometimes hot and sometimes cold, sometimes loving and sometimes hateful, sometimes rejecting and sometimes embracing, approach, avoidance, repetition, compulsion, unpredictable, indeterminate, and therefore not a secure base. That also generates narcissism. Narcissism is a defense. It's an attempt to do two things: transform oneself into a godlike, untouchable, invincible, invulnerable figure. Because a child experiences so much pain, so much frustration, is so terrified and intimidated by the capriciousness and arbitrariness of the adults in his or her life, that at some point the child gives up on itself. The child says, as I am right now, I'm not going to survive. I need to become someone else pronto. And the child becomes someone else. He becomes a false self. The child creates a godlike figure, a divinity, and becomes this divinity, merges and fuses with their divinity in a symbiotic kind of relationship. So this is the first element of the defense. And the second element of the defense, the child creates a fantasy and migrates from reality to the fantasy. Reality, in the case of such children, is unbearable and intolerable and life-threatening, very often life-threatening. So they need to avoid and withdraw, and they create a paracosm, which is a kind of elaborate virtual reality. And then they transition into this virtual reality. And in order to not feel the arrows and slings of mother, they become godlike. Now, unfortunately, this defense survives into adulthood. Freud was the first to observe this. He said that primary narcissism becomes secondary narcissism. And it survives into adulthood. And then as an adult, you prefer fantasy to reality. And you defend yourself against the pain and loss of reality by pretending that you're God. Simply, you're a divinity. And if your divinity is challenged, you externalize aggression. You become violent, verbally or physically or whatever. This is, in a nutshell, this is narcissism. It's a child. And one of the major mistakes we make in therapy is that we try to treat narcissists as if they were adults. We try to strike a therapeutic alliance with the narcissist, negotiate with the narcissist, treatment goals in a treatment plan. That's utterly ridiculous. A typical narcissist is anywhere between 2 and 4 years old. We need to treat narcissism using tools from child psychology and, of course, trauma therapies. The child is heavily traumatized.
The way that this adaptation to early stressors manifests in adulthood seems to have different nuances, and you've talked about different types. Is it important to know about these sort of subtle patterns within the category of narcissism, or do they all stem from such a similar place that the behaviors are all really related?
We used to think that there are two types of narcissists. We used to think that there are overt, grandiose narcissists and covert, vulnerable, shy, fragile narcissists. We no longer believe this. Definitely not in the practitioners community. There's a gap, there's an abyss between the practitioners community and academia. Academia is light years behind the practitioners community, actually. But even in academia, more progressive voices begin to understand that all narcissists are both overt and covert. That the choice of style, whether to be overt or covert, depends crucially on the availability and regularity of narcissistic supply. So when the narcissist experiences something called collapse, when the narcissist becomes less self-efficacious or less efficacious in obtaining supply, when he fails to obtain supply, but on a regular basis, then most narcissists become covert for a while, become covert. They build up sources of narcissistic supply and they become overt again. So there's no type constancy. We also have somatic versus cerebral narcissists. It's something I was the first to describe. Somatic narcissists derive narcissistic supply using their bodies, their sexuality, their musculature, their attire, their sartorial choices, their looks. While cerebral narcissists use their intellect or leverage their intellect, intelligence, incisiveness to obtain supply. And again, there's no type constancy. A cerebral narcissist who fails to obtain supply, who undergoes a phase of collapse, would become somatic. A somatic narcissist would attempt to become cerebral, which is a pretty pathetic sight, but it does happen. So there's no type constancy. I think at the core of all this is the following equation. Narcissists have learned as children that they can elicit positive emotions from the environment, especially love, only when they perform. So everything is founded on performance. Narcissists are thespian, they're actors, but not in the sense that they're deceiving people, in the sense that they believe they have to act all the time in order to obtain supply. And the false self is a kind of a mega theater production, a Broadway production. And so because they believe that everything depends on performance, the minute they, for some reason, don't perform well or don't perform according to expectations, their own expectations, they're perfectionists. So perfectionistic. So when they don't perform well, they collapse. They simply fall apart. It's a process known in some schools of psychology as decompensation. Their defenses shut down and they fall apart, they disintegrate. And then the only solution is to become not you. Again, it's a typical feature of narcissism. Narcissism is founded on performance, and if you fail to perform, the solution is to give up on yourself, to deny yourself, and to become someone else. The child becomes the false self. The cerebral becomes somatic. The somatic becomes cerebral. The covert becomes overt. The overt becomes covert. We call this identity disturbance. Exactly like in borderline personality disorder. There is no core identity. Narcissism, there's nothing there. It's what used to be called in the 90s an empty schizoid core. There's a void, there's a black hole where a human being or person should have been. And so this shape-shifting kaleidoscopic metamorphoses, they're compensatory. They're intended to compensate for deep-set sense of inferiority and fragility and vulnerability. And this is an automatic process. This is a lifelong automatic process that is a major determinant of narcissism, defines narcissism. Narcissism is absence masquerading as presence. Narcissism is about the art of not being. That's narcissism. And it is, people can't wrap their heads around it. They just can't. They're trying to explain narcissism in terms of objects, other people as objects, physical objects as objects, I don't know, goals. So they attribute to narcissists malice and premeditation, and that's not the case. There's simply nobody there. As Kernberg had observed about borderlines, there's emptiness there. And yet there is the need to feel that you belong to the human species, that you're normal somehow. There's compulsive normalcy. There's the wish to appear, to function, to fit into a peer group, if you wish. And this constant failure, because you cannot convert absence into presence. You cannot. It's doomed to failure. Narcissist sets himself up for failure all the time. It's a process of grief. It's what we call today prolonged grief disorder. The narcissist grieves the true self, grieves the child, grieves the lost potential. The narcissist grieves what he could have become and never will. And so narcissists are heavily invested in becoming, in being, in existing, in which, as far as other people are concerned, it's a background thing. I mean, you don't sit around saying, okay, now I have to exist. Or, but narcissists do actually. Narcissists do sit around and say, no one is noticing me. I'm
Yeah,
not
it's
being seen.
existential, right? It's existential
Yes.
matter.
I'm not being seen, so I don't exist. I need to be noticed. Otherwise, I will not exist.
One of the many shadow elements of, psychological pathology and psychiatric diagnosis that I have contended with is the way that these frameworks are used to other, right? And to foster projection of our own disavowed shadow elements onto those sick people, onto those disordered people. I'm not like that, right? And in your description just now, I was really reflecting on how many of my patients would say the same phrase to me as they emancipated from medications and, diagnoses, at least identifying with that rubric. They would say, I finally feel like myself. And there's an element of what you're describing, even with, what is referred to as like imposter syndrome, right? There's an element that I think is quite relatable. This idea that we have been enculturated to perform in order to secure attention and approval and a sense of safety. And that when that fails, we kind of like, skitter off into another sense of self-identity, behavioral pattern. And so there are elements of what you're describing that feel common enough. And it also seems like what you're saying is that the relational consequences in certain individuals that you would describe as narcissists are different than those of us who might otherwise, have general insecurity or a sense of a diffused core. So I'd love to dive into this because your depiction of the relational patterns, especially romantic, I think is one of the most clear, that is out there. And as much as you describe that there isn't an opportunity, for a maturation or an integration or a so-called healing, there is an effort, it sounds like, in romantic relationships to individuate, right? And to experience what was not experienced maturationally, if you're saying that these individuals are walking around, like 2 to 4 year olds. So I wonder if you could take us through, sort of the phases, what I've heard you describe as the phases of, the kinds of, and I know you don't always use the term codependent, right? But colloquially, that's what a lot of people talk about, the narcissist and the
Yeah.
codependent.
I don't mind using.
Okay. So a classical, sort of romantic dyad, how that looks, what is the subconscious perhaps intention on the part of, this individual who's in this pattern of narcissism? What happens? What are the stages, and how does it end up typically?
The reason you identify with so many elements of narcissism is because it's primordial. It's primordial. The baby needs to be seen. Babies who are not seen are also usually dead babies, end up as dead babies. Their survival depends on being noticed and seen.
Yeah.
Their newborns have embedded cues intended to elicit and solicit the mother's attention. Because by far the most important thing as far as survival goes is being seen. By the way, into adulthood. There are studies that have demonstrated conclusively that if you're socially shunned, you pay a very high price in terms of health, physical health, and so on and so forth. So it starts from there. It's a baby thing. Don't forget also that narcissism, at least in some schools of thought, narcissism is a healthy phase in development, in early development. It's known as primary narcissism. And this is something that's been agreed on by adversaries such as Freud and Jung, for example. They both agreed that narcissism is a crucial phase in development, early childhood development, and so on and so forth. And regardless of whether you believe in the jargon or lingo of narcissism, or whether you think narcissism is a science, I don't. I still think narcissism does capture, psychology does capture truths, some truths, And I still believe that language is an important role in evoking or provoking insight and so on. So I place a lot of emphasis on language, and I believe that when I say, for example, that there is such a thing as narcissism, I'm not just, it's not self-referential. I believe there is something like that. And so both the need to be seen, which is relational, because you're seen by others, and narcissism, they're both real and they're both early childhood phenomena and therefore primordial. They're atavistic and you can't get rid of them, and they're lifelong. That's why you identify with so many features of narcissism. What is something goes awry in this process? When you as a baby need to be seen, you still don't make a distinction between yourself and the world. So this used to be known as the symbiotic phase. You still don't have this awareness. I am baby, and then there's the rest of the world. It's all one big mishmash. It's all a huge mess. So you're actually observing yourself. When you need to be seen and then you are seen, you don't perceive it. You don't say to yourself, "It's mommy who is watching me. It's mommy who is seeing me." You say to yourself, "It's me. I am seeing me. I am watching me." And that's how primary narcissism evolves and develops. And at some stage, a good mother pushes the child away, pushes him away, pushes the child away, allows the child to separate from her and to become an individual and acquire personhood. A mother who doesn't let this process unfurl and unfold creates narcissists, potentially, not in all cases, because the child then is unable to extricate itself and see itself from the outside, which is a precondition for the formation of a self. So here you are, you have children, 2 to 4 years old, in adult bodies, and they're still stuck in a stage where they don't feel being seen from the outside. They don't experience the existence of other people. They've never separated, and so they don't know how to separate, and they don't recognize the separateness of other people. So they are still in this symbiotic kind of womb, and yet there is this innate drive to separate and individuate. So what they do, they pick up an intimate partner, and they convert the intimate partner into a mother figure, maternal function. And then they reenact the whole process of separation and individuation with this maternal figure. So the shared fantasy, this is called shared fantasy. It's not my term. It was first described by Sander in 1989. So the shared fantasy is not about being together. It's about separating. Shared fantasy leads, its goal, its culmination is separation and then becoming an individual. People think that the shared fantasy is about being together forever, merging, fusing, becoming one. No, it's exactly the opposite. The shared fantasy is about becoming two. The narcissist is always in a condition of being one with everyone. He is always merged and fused. He wants to become two, not one. He wants finally to separate. And this is the role of the fantasy. But you need to capture someone to collaborate, to collude in the fantasy. You need to somehow. So how to do that? You have to lure them. You have to lure them somehow. So the narcissist comes to you and offers you a fantasy. First of all, the narcissist identifies whether you can provide what I call the 4 S's. The 4 S's are sex, supply, sadistic or narcissistic, safety, constant presence, object constancy, constant presence, and services. If you can provide two of the four, two of the four S's, you're in. Okay, you qualify. And then the narcissist needs to capture you, to captivate you, to kind of, and so narcissist offers you a deal. The deal is two stages, two phases. The first phase is known colloquially as love bombing. During the first phase, the narcissist idealizes you, and then he grants you access to your idealized image through his gaze, through his gaze. And so you fall in love with your own idealized image. I call it the hall of mirror effect. You fall in love with your own, you don't fall in love with the narcissist, you fall in love with the way the narcissist sees you. You fall in love with the way the narcissist loves you. It's so intense, it's so focused on you, you're so idealized, you're hyper intelligent, you can do no wrong, you're perfect, you're drop dead gorgeous. It's a wonderful feeling, it's flattering. It's, in other words, narcissistic supply. It triggers in you your own narcissism. And because it triggers in you your own narcissism, it also regresses you. You become more infantile and more dependent on the narcissist. So this is the first ingredient in the deal. The second ingredient in the deal, the narcissist exposes to you his childlike aspects. He allows you to see him as a child. And this triggers in you maternal instincts or reflexes. Even if you're men, even if you're male. Men also like babies, yeah, not only women. So you fall in love with a child, which the narcissist is. One could even say that to some extent the narcissist grants you access to his catatonic, ossified true self. And this provokes in you not only a maternal instinct or reflex, but also a protective reflex. You want to cuddle this child, you want to hug this child, you want to revive this child, resuscitate it. It's a bit religious. It's a bit like, Jesus with the resurrection. I claim generally that Narcissism is a form of private religion. Anyhow.
What's an example, Sam, of how that would be induced? That caretaking response on the part of the
Not initially. Initially, it's exactly the opposite. Initially, the
right.
narcissist comes to you and acts as a maternal figure.
Right.
Initially, the narcissist offers you to be your mother. He's going to idealize you. He's going to love you unconditionally. He's going to regard you as perfect. He's going to give you access to this view of yourself, and thereby you become addicted. That's initially. And then once you're hooked, the narcissist says, okay, he takes you for granted now. He says, okay, now I need you to act as my mother. And the narcissist exposes to you his childlike features. For example, his learned helplessness, his dependency on you, his neediness. In short, the codependent aspects of narcissism, which are very often ignored. And then you're double hooked. The narcissist becomes both your mother and your child, and you become both mother and child to the narcissist. And I call this the dual mothership. It's a dual mothership structure. And things proceed. So now you idealize each other. There's a process of co-idealization. You idealize each other. You are each other's mother and each other's child. The bonding is tremendous. There's nothing like it in a normal, healthy relationship. Nothing as intense and as profound as the bonding in a shared fantasy.
Do you think this
Nothing
is
remotely.
what's colloquially referred to as trauma bonding? Do you think there's any utility in that phrase?
Trauma bonding is actually a self-harming reaction to this. It's a self-harming reaction, but yes, it's an element because this provokes self-harming later. But it's an element, yes. Trauma bonding is an element. It's an addiction, actually, but it's very intense and very profound because it touches everything that is core, It touches your narcissism, touches your childhood, It touches your maternal instincts. It touches your protective instincts. It triggers everything in you, and you're doomed. You're hooked. Now that you're each other's mothers, the narcissist can proceed. He doesn't do so consciously. It's not premeditated. It's not evil. It's not wicked. This is psychopaths. People confuse psychopaths with narcissists. Now the narcissist proceeds. Because now you are his mother, all the old childhood templates are reinvoked. They come alive. The narcissist has had a single experience of interacting with a mother. So now he takes this experience and applies it to you. Now you're his mother. And he goes through the motions of being your child in a desperate attempt to separate from you. Because that's what children do with mothers, separate from you and become an individual. But in this particular case, it's a problem because you've been idealized. How do you separate from an ideal object that is irrational? But there's another problem here. It's a challenge to grandiosity. Because if I need to separate from you and you are an ideal object, it means I've been wrong about you somehow. I misjudged you somehow. Otherwise, why would I want to get rid of you? Something's wrong. So the narcissist needs, therefore, to convert you from an ideal object to a persecutory object, to an enemy. And having done that, he can devalue you and discard you. And that's the only way to separate from you. You cannot remain an idealized object. You must become something lesser, a devalued version of yourself, to allow the narcissist to separate from you. And that's the end of the shared fantasy, more or less in a nutshell. It's much more complex than this, but in a nutshell, that's the end of the shared fantasy. Narcissist separates from you by discarding you and devaluing you and discarding you. He remains stuck with a persecutory object of you in his mind. And this leads much later to a compulsion to regain you somehow, to re-idealize you. And this is known as hoovering. But these are the basic mechanisms.
And so the intimate partner typically is the one to end these relationships, I think, right? Where you've seen that they're induced to become almost the abuser to facilitate the rupture of the relationship. And I've heard you say that mourning that end of the shared fantasy is in its own way remaining in the shared fantasy. So can you speak a little bit to how the denouement of this kind of relationship and how it typically
Because the shared fantasy is such a profound, the word is profound. It's a replay of early childhood processes, dynamics, and mechanisms. So it's utterly, so because it's so profound and so on, the grief is equally profound. And it's multiple grief. In the wake of the shared fantasy, whether you were the one to dump the narcissist or vice versa, in the wake of the shared fantasy, you're mourning your child, which is a narcissist. You're mourning yourself, of course. You've been hurt, you're in pain, so you're mourning yourself. You're mourning the child. You're mourning the fantasy. The fantasy is a narrative with future aspects or future elements. We're going to have a family, we're going to have 3 children, and this and that. So you're mourning this vision of the future, which for a very long time energized you and gave meaning to your life and organized it. And suddenly you find yourself in outer space, deep chaos, lacking direction and purpose. And so you're mourning this. You're mourning what the relationship could have become, taking into account your investment and so on and so forth. And the good aspects of the narcissist. There are many things of narcissist that you do like. So you're mourning this potential, this lost potential. But I think above all, the fact that you're mourning a lost child combined with the fact that you're mourning a lost you mourning yourself. This is absent in other breakups. In other breakups, you usually mourn the vision that you've had together, which may have been fantastic or not. Usually it's realistic, but may have been fantastic. And you're mourning what could have been. And that's bad enough. Broken heart syndrome is real. That's bad enough. Now imagine adding to that, mourning a child that you loved with all your heart, the maternal experience and so on, and then mourning a lost identity, your identity. This is what the narcissist does, is a process known as entraining. The narcissist actually invades your mind or infiltrates your mind and installs there an app. Think of yourself as a smartphone. He installs an app, and the app is the narcissist's voice, the introject of the narcissist. And this app remains with you after the physical separation. This voice remains in your head. You keep talking to the narcissist. And worse still, the narcissist keeps talking to you. This dialogue continues long after the breakup. And so there is this to contend with. It is this form of grief is potentially self-negating and self-annihilating, could have seriously bad outcomes. It involves almost automatically complex trauma, emotional dysregulation. It provokes in many victims, it provokes narcissistic and psychopathic behaviors. You change, you feel that you've changed. You feel that you're no longer the same and would never ever be the same, which is not true. The prognosis is actually very good, especially with professional help. But in the meantime, you have the feeling that you are damaged for good, or at the very least that you have changed forever. And it's terrifying in a way because you are estranged. There's a process called estrangement. You're estranged, you're alienated. You don't feel good with yourself. You don't feel that you know yourself, that you're comfortable with yourself. You're ego dystonic. You know, it's a horrible feeling. You are not even sure who is doing the mourning. Who is the one who is grieving? Is it really you? Or is it the narcissist compelling you to grieve for him? Because you feel a total externalized locus of control. You feel that it all emanates from the outside. You feel like a puppet on a string. You feel there's a puppet master. Regardless of his physical presence or absence, he's still there. And so you can never be sure what part is you and which part is him. And which part is a fantasy, which may be still unfurling or unfolding in your head. It's a total disorientation. And I would compare it, as far as experience goes, subjective experience, I think I can compare it only to psychosis. It's because in psychosis we have something called hyperreflexivity. It's kind of expansion of the self to include the world. And here I think it's the same. The victim's self, so to speak, these are all metaphors, yes? No one has ever captured the self in a laboratory. But the victim's self, sense of self, expands to include the narcissist and to include the fantasy. And when the narcissist is gone, the result is psychotic because the reality element is gone. And what is left is the perception. And the perception is definitely counterfactual, unrealistic. And that's a great definition of psychosis. So what I'm trying to say is this. In the wake of a relationship involving a narcissist and narcissistic abuse, I don't think you can overcome this by yourself. I think you need help. And another thing is, you need to separate from the narcissist because you have been regressed to infancy. You're an infant. And so you need now to separate from the maternal figure, which is a narcissist, and to individuate. It's like back to square one. It's like starting from scratch. It's like learning to walk again after a horrible accident. and it takes years. The aftermath is horrible. It takes years, but the prognosis is good.
And I've heard you say that you feel it's an opportunity to learn self-love, to learn self-reclamation, and to really develop self-relational intimacy that may not have otherwise been available absent the, abusive experience in the romantic relationship. So that there is this opportunity that is conferred by the challenges of that kind of dynamic, should you have the right kind of support and will, interest, wherewithal, readiness that is, unique. It sounds like there is a lot of hope. Why is that not the case for, the identified narcissist? Why is there not, in your opinion, this hope for redemption, courtesy of the individuation opportunity that was created in the romantic experience, do you think?
Because the narcissist has nothing to go back to.
Yeah.
You have existed prior to the narcissist. You have institutional memory of your selfhood. You have experienced how it feels to be you. You have memory of how you conducted yourself when you were you. And the support you get is simply to a kind of regress you back to who you were before the. So there's somewhere to go back to. It's like refugees, war refugees. The country is still there. The war will end one day, and you can go back. The narcissist has nowhere to go back to, and nothing to go back to. To use the metaphors of true self and false self, the narcissist's trajectory of personal development as a child has been disrupted. Consequently, the narcissist never formed a sense of selfhood and identity and some stable core. So the narcissist can separate from the mother or from the maternal figure, but can never individuate. The problem is not the separation. Narcissist separates dozens of times in a lifetime. They can never individuate, because to individuate, you need a relation with yourself. Individuation is essentially defined, is an environmentally defined process. So you individuate by internalizing the gaze of others. Other people see you. Because they see you, you realize that you are being seen, that there is a you that is being seen. So, and this is a crucial facet. So other people see you, this creates a boundary, and within the boundary, you emerge, you become. This is Lacan, by the way. So, but the narcissist doesn't have any element of this process, not a single one. He cannot relate to other people as separate or external. So their gaze is meaningless. It's in internal gaze. And he doesn't have a self. Nothing can emerge. He doesn't do object relations, so he has no relationships. He has no relational experience. Narcissists don't have, they're solipsistic. And so the narcissist is doomed to remain stuck in this emptiness, in this black hole, and to desperately attempt, time and again, to separate and individuate, and accumulate a library of idealized and then devalued introjects, snapshots of his intimate partners and friends and so on. Just to be clear, the shared fantasy is applicable to all the narcissist relationships, not only intimate, not only romantic. The narcissist does exactly the same thing with a good friend, or with a boss, or with a role model, or with a teacher. It's the same. It's all shared fantasy. And you see, even your question includes the implication or the underlying assumption that there is somebody there. Why can't he? There's no he. Language breaks in the face of narcissism. Simply breaks. So few of us have had the experience of not being, perhaps with the exception of some gurus in India or something. And ironically, this is considered to be something to aspire to in certain mystical and religious traditions. Nothingness, the not being. Well, narcissists are there already, and it sucks. So you may wish to reconsider some mystical teachings. Yeah.
Is it the case that you have identified with this kind of a label personally? And if that's true, how has that informed your, perspective that there isn't a maturational road, there isn't an evolution, there isn't a dimension of self-insight that can develop?
I've been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder twice. It's pretty safe to assume that I am a narcissist. However, I spent the last 30 years um, studying the topic and working with well over 2,000 people with NPD, with narcissistic personality disorder. And all these people had to prove to me that they're not comorbid. So these are people who have only narcissistic personality disorder. They don't have borderline or antisocial or whatever. So these are the pure, unadulterated cases of narcissism, diagnosed by diagnostician and so on. I work with well over 2,000 of these, 2,200 by now. And so I think everything I'm saying is not based on personal experience. Actually, I'm an adulterated type because I have narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. So it would be bad practice, as far as I'm concerned, to look to introspect and derive any. No, everything I'm saying is based on essentially research. I'm not aware of any study which comprises 2,000 narcissists. I think it's the biggest database in the world, as far as I know. So I feel pretty confident in saying what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Now, I'm also eclectic. I'm accused of trying to revive psychoanalysis, what object relations. That is expressly untrue. I use tools wherever they come handy. So I use internal family system. I use transactional analysis. I use psychoanalysis. I use object relation schools. I use, I don't see. I think it's idiotic to proscribe and to say psychoanalysis. No, you should never ever mention psychoanalysis. There's absolutely nothing to learn from psychoanalysis, which is what they teach in Harvard and this kind of school. If you dare to mention psychoanalysis, you're done. You're dead. It's idiotic, simply idiotic. And it all has to do with the pretension to science. Like, we are scientists, we don't do psychoanalysis. We do laboratories, we do white coats, we do statistics. We don't do psychoanalysis. There's a minor problem with psychology. The raw material. The raw material is mutable, unstable. You can never replicate an experiment in psychology. Period. The replication crisis in psychology is not incidental and not the outcome of bad practice. It's the raw material, stupid. You simply cannot replicate experiments with the same person, let alone with, because the experiment changes the person. So, but I think we can generalize, we can observe, we can describe, we can capture in the equivalent of literature many insights about human existence. And because we do have a lot in common. I think human beings have a lot in common. And we can try to somehow nail down this commonality. And the key is language, not statistics. Many psychologists think that if they do statistics, they are scientists. I have a PhD in physics. That is science. Psychology is not. I can compare. I'm an active physicist. Physics is science. Psychology is not. But physics cannot capture the commonality of pain and love and grief and the emptiness inside a narcissist or a borderline. Language can. And so we need to reconceive of psychology as literature. I think then we'll be much more useful to our patients and our colleagues and the community at large.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I wonder in closing, Sam, if there are any red flags that you think are worth paying attention to learning in terms of the dynamic relationships that, individuals might engage with those expressing a narcissistic pattern. Not because I believe in victims per se, but because I believe that it could generate even more self-awareness when we recognize we're a match for this kind of experience. And I think so much of what you've articulated today I know that it will serve in this self-awareness and self-discovery process for those who have otherwise identified as victims of narcissistic abuse. And I like to say that suffering ends where meaning begins. So if you can find meaning in these experiences, you're necessarily learning more about yourself. So what might be, do you think, some Cosmopolitan magazine red flags, like 10 red flags for this kind of dynamic and looking out for it? You've described some, including the nature of the love bombing in the beginning that is to be distinguished from just run-of-the-mill falling in love. What else might you suggest?
Before I go cosmopolitan on you, um, victimhood, identity victimhood, is a form of narcissism.
Right, I've heard you say that.
That is not Sam Vaknin. These are studies by Gabay and others. In Israel, studies in British Columbia. There's a growing body of studies that shows that victimhood can be used as a manipulative tool. It's a form of entitlement, and it involves covert narcissism at the very least. It's a form of virtue signaling and so on. Okay, that aside, because I have many videos dedicated to this, just ask yourself, who is the narcissist? Narcissists subsist in fantasy. They reject reality. So in your initial interactions with the narcissist, is he down to earth? Is he grounded, or is he a dreamer? Is he a fantasizer? That's a warning sign. Narcissists have no object constancy. They fear abandonment and separation. So is he being controlling? Does he micromanage you? And I'm not talking about 2 years into the relationship. I'm talking about the first date. The first date. Does he take the keys from you and locks your door? Does he drive the car? Does he decide which restaurant you go to? Does he interrogate you after you've powdered your nose? Does he select the food, and so on and so forth? Control, signals of control. Next, the narcissist idealizes you, but at the same time he holds everyone else in contempt. If you see a discrepancy between the way the narcissist is treating you and the narcissist is treating other people, on a first date, he shouts at the waiter, he humiliates the cab driver or the Uber driver, but he treats you as a queen or as a princess. It's a serious warning sign. This is known as splitting. It's a serious warning sign. The alacrity, the speed is unusual. A narcissist would offer you cohabitation on first date if he's slow, family of the second date, and you would have 3 children by the third. The speed is outlandish and indicative of a pathology because he needs to secure. It's compulsive. You feel the compulsion. It's not desperation. It's compulsion. It's utterly, So there's a lot of energy, too much energy. Next are the speech patterns. Does he talk about himself incessantly and shuts you down whenever you try to speak? Or that's one variant. And the other variant, does he keep utterly silent and kind of sponges information off you as if he were constructing some criminal file, it's as if this were some kind of police interrogation. So either too voluble and too verbose, or totally silent. These are two warning signs. A typical conversation is 50-50. These are warning signs. Next, how intense is he? He's interested in you. It's normal on a date. But does he go too deep too soon? Does he try to somehow fulfill a role like a guru, a teacher, a father, an insightful genius? All this on the first date. Now, why do I keep saying all this on the first date? Because people lie to themselves and they say the narcissist is a great actor, and so he pulled the wool over my eyes. He deceived me. It took me months to realize who he truly is. The mask fell only after 2 years. That's utter nonsense. All the warning signs and red alerts are there within the first 5 minutes. It even has a name. This is called the uncanny valley reaction. In 1970, there was a roboticist, a Japanese, of course. How else? The roboticist, his name was Masahiro Mori. And Masahiro Mori described a very interesting phenomenon. The more a robot resembles a human being, the more android a robot is, the less comfortable people feel in the robot's presence. And this is known as uncanny valley reaction. Uncanny was a phrase coined by Freud, actually. So when you are with a narcissist, you have an uncanny valley reaction, because a narcissist is exactly this. It's a programmed robot, which is very android. It's a great simulation of a human being, but there's something off key. There's something off note. There's something awry. There's something wrong. It's not put together to perfection. And you react with an uncanny valley reaction. But you suppress the reaction. You deny it. Because, I don't know, you're lonely. And finally, you're dating after 2 years. And, you want it to be a success. Or because you doubt yourself. You have what we call autoplastic defenses. You failed with so many guys and tell yourself, it's probably my fault, I'm too something, I'm too critical, I'm too this, I'm too that. This is wrong. Pay attention to your intuition and gut instinct. They're right 90% of the time when it comes to other people. By the way, intuition is right only 50% of the time, generally speaking. But when it comes to people, it's right 90% of the time. Trust yourself. If you feel that something's wrong, if you feel that something is off key, if you feel that this guy or this girl, they're like a simulation, they're put together well, they resemble people, human beings, but there's something wrong there, just go away, run, cut it out and just walk away. You have to trust yourself. You have all the information you need within minutes. Imagine how much information is exchanged once you have had a conversation, or once you've been able to observe the behavior of the person, the way he interacts with other people, unexpected situations, stresses, something goes wrong, something goes right. Is he too elated and grandiose when something goes right? Takes the credit, attributes it to himself. Or is he rageful? Is he frustrated visibly and volubly when something goes wrong? Does he take it out on other people? Does he constantly blame other people? When he talks about his job, does he complain of being discriminated against, overlooked, and so on? Pay attention, simply. All the information you need is on the first date. Anything that happens afterwards is your choice and decisions. You're an adult, and you should pay the price for your choices and decisions. The consequences of your actions are yours and yours only. No one else is to blame. And if you do blame others, and if you split, the narcissist is demonic and you are an angel, you have become a narcissist.
Right.
Because that's what narcissists do.
Right. So profound. Thank you so much for this
Thank you for having me.
candid hour, and so such a clear framework for us to work with, not only, again, just the point that you just made, for understanding patterns of human behavior that we see all over, whether that's, clinically or socioculturally, but also as, a call and invitation to take personal responsibility for our relational experiences, as we might otherwise identify as victims and engage in the self same psychology. It's very
That's the
deep.
major, that's the
Yeah, the
main takeaway.
mirroring, the
Main
mirroring.
takeaway is this.
Yeah, and you've depicted that with tremendous clarity. So thank you.
Thank you for
And
having me.
I'd love for you to share any resources or support that you offer to people who are finding themselves in this realm.
I have a YouTube channel. Now, in the description part of each and every video, there's a literature section. So you may wish to proceed on your own. There are well over 1,400 videos. They're divided into playlists. So each playlist is thematic. And that's the most I could do to help you to navigate your way around this resource. It's, I think, a, a big resource. I mean,
Absolutely.
1,400.
I would
It's about
absolutely agree.
1,000 hours of video. So I don't think there's much more I can say that I haven't
That's
said already.
that's perfect. Well, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for being in this conversation with me.
Thank you for being with me. Take care. Bye bye.